Act 2, Scene 1, read by Mr. Allison. Quickly, let's go over some of the events in Scene 4 and Scene 5. The events that take place in Scene 4 basically reveal the tensions between Anne and two other members of the household. Those tensions are between Anne and Dussel. Her refusal to speak to her mother reveals the tensions between Anne and her mother, Mrs. Frank. And then suddenly we also hear a crash from downstairs that interrupts the Hanukkah celebration. That happens whenever Peter, he climbs to turn off the lamp, and the chair slips, and then the lamp falls. And a suspected thief who is caught, basically, he could attempt to bargain with the Green Police by telling them about the people in hiding. So there's a lot of conflict that's going on here at this moment. So Act 2, Scene 1, it basically begins with we hear Anne. She's talking about the changes that are taking place in her body. And that is despite the confinement of her being trapped in there, Anne is suddenly start to grow up. This is the date of January the 1st, 1944. The family is suddenly visited by Miep and Mr. Crowler, who brings them a little surprise to the house. And as we begin, on page 411, Act 2, Scene 1. In the darkness, we hear Anne's voice, again reading from the diary. Anne's voice starts.
Saturday, the 1st of January, 1944. Another new year has begun, and we found ourselves still in our hiding place. We have been here for now 1 year, 5 months, and 25 days. It seems that our life is at a standstill.
The curtain rises on the scene. It is late afternoon. Everyone is bundled up against the cold. In the main room, Mrs. Frank is taking down the laundry, which is hung across the back. Mr. Frank sits in the chair down left, reading. Margot is lying on the couch with a blanket over her and the many-colored knitted scarf around her throat. Anne is seated at the center table, writing in her diary. Peter, Mr. and Mrs. Van Daan, and Dussel are all in their own rooms, reading or lying down. As the lights dim on, Anne's voice continues without a break. Anne's voice goes.
We are all a little thinner. The Van Daan's discussions are as violent as ever. Mother still does not understand me. But then I don't understand her either. There is one great change, however. A change in myself. I read somewhere that girls of my age don't feel quite certain of themselves. That they become quiet within and begin to think of the miracles that's taking place in their bodies. I think that what is happening to me is so wonderful. Not only what can be seen, but what is taking place inside. Each time it has happened, I have a feeling that I have a sweet secret.
We hear the chimes and then a hymn being played on the carillon outside.
Dum, dum, dum. And in spite of any pain, I long for the time when I shall feel that secret within me again.
Bzzz. The buzzer of the door below suddenly sounds. Bzzz, bzzz, bzzz. Everyone is startled. Mr. Frank tiptoes cautiously to the top of the steps and listens. Again the buzzer sounds. And Miep's V for victory signal. Mr. Frank says, It's Miep. He goes quickly down the steps to unbolt the door. Mrs. Frank calls upstairs to the Van Daans and then to Peter. Mrs. Frank says,
Wake up, everybody. Miep is here.
Anne quickly puts her diary away. Margot sits up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. Dussel sits on the edge of his bed, listening. Disgruntled. Miep comes up the steps, followed by Mr. Crowler. They bring flowers, books, newspapers, etc. Anne rushes to Miep, throwing her arms affectionately around her.
Miep! And Mr. Crowler, what a delightful surprise.
We came to bring you New Year's greetings, says Mr. Crowler. You shouldn't. You should have at least stayed 1 day to yourselves. She goes quickly up to the stove and brings down teacups and tea for all of them. Anne says,
Don't say that. It's so wonderful to see them.
Sniffing at Miep's coat.
Ah, I can smell the wind and the cold in your clothes.
Miep giving her the flowers.
There you are.
Then to Margot, feeling her forehead. Miep speaks.
Are you feeling any better? I'm all right,
says Margot.
We filled her full of every kind of pill so she won't cough and make a noise,
says Anne. She runs into her room to put the flowers in the water. Mr. and Mrs. Van Daan come from upstairs. Outside, there is a sound of a band playing. Mrs. Van Daan says,
Well, hello, Miep. Mr. Crowler?
Mr. Crowler giving a bouquet of flowers to Mrs. Van Daan. With my hope for peace in the new year. Peter anxiously,
Miep, have you seen Mushy? Have you seen him anywhere around?
Miep says,
I'm sorry, Peter. I've asked everyone in the neighborhood, had they seen a gray cat, but they said no.
Mrs. Frank gives Miep a cup of tea. Mr. Frank comes up the steps carrying a small cake on a plate. Look what Miep has brought for us. Mrs. Frank taking it.
A cake.
Mr. Van Daan.
A cake!
He pinches Miep's cheeks gaily and hurries up to the cupboard.
I'll get some plates.
Mr. Dussel, in his room, hastily puts on a coat and starts up to join the others. Mrs. Frank says,
Thank you, Miep. You shouldn't have done it. You must have used all of your sugar rations for the week.
Giving it to Mrs. Van Daan.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
Oh, it's been ages since I'd even saw a cake. Not since you brought us one last year.
Without looking at the cake to Miep.
Remember? Don't you remember you gave us one on New Year's Day? Just this time last year. I'll never forget it because you had Peace in 1943 written on it.
She looks at the cake and it reads,
Peace in 1944.
Well,
Miep says,
it has to come sometime. You know.
as Dussel comes from his room.
Hello, Mr. Dussel.
Mr. Crowler speaks.
How are you?
Mr. Van Daan, bringing plates and a knife.
Here's the knife, Liefje. Now, how many of us are there?
None for me, thank you.
Says Miep. Oh, please, you must, says Mr. Frank.
I couldn't.
Says Miep. Mr. Van Daan says,
Good. That leaves 1, 2, 3, 7 of us.
Mr. Dussel comes out.
8. It's the same number as always is.
Mr. Van Daan.
I left Margot out. I take it for granted Margot won't eat any.
Anne says.
Why wouldn't she?
Mrs. Frank says. I think it won't harm her. Mr. Van Daan.
All right. I just didn't want her to start coughing again. That's all.
Dussel says.
And please, Miss Frank should cut the cake.
Mr. Van Daan.
What's the difference?
It's not Mrs. Frank's cake, is it, Miep? It's for all of us.
Well, Mrs. Frank divides things better.
What are you trying to say?
Oh, come on, just stop wasting time.
Mrs. Van Daan to Dussel.
Don't I always give everybody exactly the same? Don't I?
Forget it, Curly.
No! I want an answer! Don't I?
Yes. Everybody gets exactly the same. Except Mr. Van Daan always gets a little more.
Mr. Van Daan advances to Dussel, the knife still in his hand.
That's a lie.
Dussel retreats before the onslaught of the Van Daans. Mr. Frank. Please! Then to Miep. You see what a little sugar cake does to us? Goes right to our heads. Mr. Van Daan handing Mrs. Frank the knife.
Here you are, Mrs. Frank.
Thank you.
Then to Miep as she goes to the table to cut the cake.
Are you sure you won't have some?
Miep drinking her tea.
No, really. I have to go in a minute.
The sound of the band fades out in the distance. Peter speaks to Miep.
Maybe Mushy went back to our house. They say that cats, Do you ever get over there? Do you suppose you could... I'll try, Peter. The first minute I get, I'll try. But I'm afraid with him gone a week.
Make up your mind, says Dussel. Already someone has a nice big dinner from that cat.
Peter is furious, inarticulate. He starts toward Dussel, as if to hit him. Mr. Frank stops him. Mrs. Frank speaks quickly to ease the situation. Mrs. Frank to Miep.
This is delicious, Miep.
Mrs. Van Daan eating hers.
Delicious!
Mr. Van Daan finishing in one gulp.
Dirk's in luck to get a girl who can bake like this.
Miep putting down her empty teacup.
I have to run. Dirk's taking me to a party tonight.
Anne speaks.
Oh, how heavenly. Remember now what everyone is wearing and what you have to eat and everything so you can tell us tomorrow. I'll give you a full report. Goodbye, everyone.
Mr. Van Daan to Miep.
Just a minute. There's something I'd like for you to do for me.
He hurries off upstairs to the room. Mrs. Van Dam sharply.
Pootie, where are you going?
She rushes up the stairs after him, calling hysterically.
What do you want, Pootie? What are you going to do?
Miep to Peter.
What's wrong?
Peter, in his sympathy, is with his mother.
Father says he's going to sell her fur coat. She's crazy about that old fur coat.
Dussel says,
Is it possible? Is it possible that anyone is so silly as to worry about a fur coat in times like this?
Peter says,
It's none of your darn business. And if you say one more thing, I'll take you. I mean it.
There's a piercing scream from Mrs. Van Daan up above.
Coat.
She grabs at the fur coat as Mr. Van Daan is starting down the stairs with it.
No!
Shut up.
No!
Baby.
Don't you dare take that! You hear? It's mine!
It's mine.
Downstairs, Peter turns
Everything
away.
is mine.
Miserable.
My father gave me that.
My father
You
can't
didn't
take
give it
that.
to
Blah,
me.
blah, blah. Your father.
You have no
He's
right.
not here anymore,
Let
is
go
he?
of it.
I'm your father
You
now.
hear?
Mr. Van Daan pulls the coat from her hand and hurries down the stairs. Mrs. Van Daan sinks to the floor, sobbing.
Oh, shut up. Whatever. We need it for
As
money.
Mr.
you
Van
know.
Daan comes into the main room, the others look away, embarrassed for him. Mr. Van Daan says to Mr. Crowler,
Hi. Just a little discussion we were having over the advisability of selling this coat. I've often told Miss Van Daan how selfish it is of her to keep this when people are in such desperate need of clothing out there.
he gives the coat to Miep.
So if you will please to sell it for us, it could fetch a good price. And by the way, will you get me some cigarettes? I don't care what kind they are. Get all that you can.
Miep.
It's terribly difficult to get them, Mr. Van Daan, but I'll try.
Try.
Goodbye.
Do.
As she goes, Mr. Frank follows her down the steps to bolt the door after her. Mrs. Frank gives Mr. Crowler a cup of tea. Mrs. Frank speaks.
Are you sure you won't have some cake, Mr. Crowler?
Mr. Crowler speaks.
I'd better not. You're still feeling badly? What does your doctor say? I haven't been to him.
Now, Mr. Crowler. Mr. Crowler sitting on the table.
Oh, I tried. But you can't get near a doctor these days. They're so busy. After weeks, I finally managed to get one on the telephone. I told him I'd like an appointment. I wasn't feeling very well. You know what he answers? Over the telephone. Stick out your tongue.
They all laugh. He turns to Mr. Frank, and Mr. Frank comes back.
I have some contracts here. I wonder if you'd look them over with me.
Mr. Frank, putting out his hand. Of course. Mr. Crowler, as he rises.
We could go downstairs.
Mr. Frank starts ahead. Mr. Crowler speaks to the others.
Will you forgive us? I won't keep him but a minute.
He starts to follow Mr. Frank down the steps. Margot, with sudden foreboding.
What's happened? Something's happened, hasn't it, Mr. Crowler?
Mr. Crowler stops and comes back, trying to reassure Margot with a pretense of casualness.
No, really. I want your father's advice.
Margot says.
Something's gone wrong. I know it.
Mr. Frank coming back to Mr. Crowler. If it's something that concerns us here, it's better that we all hear it. Mr. Crowler turning to him quietly.
But the children.
Mr. Frank speaks. What they'd imagine would be worse than any reality. As Mr. Crowler speaks, they all listen with intense apprehension. Mrs. Van Daan comes down the stairs and sits on the bottom step. Mr. Crowler says,
It's a man in the storeroom. I don't know whether you remember him. Carl, about 50, heavy-set, Nearsighted. He came with us just before you left.
Mr. Frank speaks. He was from Utrecht. Mr. Crowther speaks.
That's the man. A couple of weeks ago, when I was in the storeroom, he closed the door and asked me, "How's Mr. Frank? What do you hear from Mr. Frank?" I told him I only knew that there was a rumor that you were in Switzerland. He said he heard that rumor too, but he thought I might know something more. I didn't pay any attention to it, but then a thing happened yesterday. He brought some invoices to the office for me to sign, as if I was going through them. I looked up. He was standing staring at the bookcase. Your bookcase. He said he thought that he remembered a door there. Wasn't there a door there that used to go up into the loft? Then he told me he wanted more money. 20 guilders. More a week. Blackmail!
20 guilders. Very modest blackmail.
That's just the beginning.
Mr. Dussel coming from Mr. Frank.
You know what I think? He was the thief who was down there that night. That's how he knows we're here.
Mr. Frank says to Mr. Crowler. How was it left? What did you tell him?
I said I had to think about it. What shall I do? Pay him the money? Take the chance on firing him or what? I don't know.
Dussel frantic.
Oh, for God's sake, don't fire him. Pay him what he asks. Keep him here where you can have your eye on him.
Mr. Frank says, is it so much that he's asking? What are they paying nowadays? Mr. Crowther says,
he could get it in a war plant, but this isn't a war plant, mind you. I don't know if he really knows or if he doesn't know.
Mr. Frank says, offer him half. Then we'll soon find out if it's blackmail or not.
And if it is, we've got to pay it, haven't we? Anything he's asked, we have to pay.
Let's just decide when the time comes, says Mr. Frank.
This may be all my imagination. You get to a point these days when you suspect everyone and everything. Again and again. On a simple look or word, I found myself.
The telephone rings in the office below. Mrs. Van Daan, hurrying to Mr. Crowler.
There's the telephone. What does that mean, the telephone ringing on a holiday?
Mr. Crowler says,
that's my wife. I told her I had to go over some papers in my office to call me there when she got out of church.
He starts out.
I'll offer him half then. Goodbye. We'll hope for the best.
The group calling their goodbyes half-heartedly. Mr. Frank follows Mr. Crowler to bolt the door below. During the following scene, Mr. Frank comes back up and stands, listening, disturbed. Dussel to Mr. Van Daan.
You can thank your son for this, smashing the light. I tell you, it's just a question of time now.
He goes to the window and back and stands looking out. Margot speaks.
Sometimes I wish the end would come, whatever it is.
Mrs. Frank shocked.
Margot!
Anne goes to Margot, sitting beside her on the couch with her arms around her. Margot says,
then at least we'd know where we were. You shouldn't be ashamed of yourself, talking that way. Think of how lucky we are. Think of the thousands dying in the war every day. Think of the people in the concentration camps.
Anne interrupting.
What's the good of that? What's the good of thinking of misery when you're already miserable? That's stupid,
Mrs. Frank says.
Anne!
As Anne goes to raging at her mother, Mrs. Frank tries breaking in an effort to quiet her. Anne says,
we're young. Margot and Peter and I. You grown-ups have had your chance, but look at us. If we begin thinking of all the horror in the world, we're lost. We're trying to hold on to some kind of ideals when everything, ideals, hopes, everything is being destroyed. It isn't our fault that the world is such a mess. We weren't around when all this started. So don't try to take it out on us.
She rushes off to her room, slamming the door after her. She picks up a brush from the chest and hurls it to the floor. She sits on the settee, trying to control her anger. Mr. Van Daan speaks.
She talks as if we started the war. Did we start the war?
He spots Anne's cake. As he starts to take it, Peter anticipates him.
She left her cake.
He starts for Anne's room with the cake. There's silence in the main room. Mrs. Van Daan goes up to her room, followed by Mr. Van Daan. Dussel stays looking out the window, and Mr. Frank brings Mrs. Frank her cake. She eats it slowly, without relish. Mr. Frank takes his cake to Margot and sits quietly on the sofa beside her. Peter stands in the doorway of Anne's darkened room, looking at her, then makes a little movement to the left to let her know he is there. Anne sits up quickly, trying to hide the signs of her tears. Peter holds out the cake to her.
You left this.
Anne dully.
Thanks.
Peter starts to go out, then comes back. Peter says,
I thought you were fine just now.
You know just how to talk to them. You know just how to say it. I'm no good. I can never think. Especially when I'm mad.
That Dussel.
When he said he thought about Mushy, someone eating him, all I could think is I wanted to hit him. I wanted to give him such that he'd... That's what I used to do when there was an argument at school. That's the way I'd... But here, and an old man like that, it wouldn't be so good. You're making a big mistake about me. I do it all wrong. I say too much. I go too far. I hurt people's feelings.
Dussel leaves the window, going to his room. Peter says,
I think you're just fine. Oh, what I want to say, if it wasn't for you around here,
I don't know what I mean. Peter's interrupted by Dussel's turning on the light. Dussel stands in the doorway, startled to see Peter. Peter advances to him forbiddingly. Dussel backs out of the room. Peter closes the door on him. Anne says,
Do you mean it, Peter? Do you really mean it?
I said it, didn't I?
Thank you, Peter.
In the main room, Mr. and Mrs. Frank collect the dishes and take them to the sink, washing them. Margot lies down again on the couch. Dussel, lost, wanders into Peter's room and takes up a book, starting to read. Peter, looking at the photographs on the wall.
You've got quite a collection. Wouldn't you like some in your room? I could give you some. Heaven knows you spend enough time in there, doing heaven knows what.
It's easier. A fight starts, or an argument. I duck in there.
You're lucky, having a room to go to.
His lordship
is always here. I hardly get a minute alone. When they start in on me, I can't duck away. I have to stand there and take it.
Peter says, You gave some of it back just now.
I get so mad. They form their opinions about everything, but we're still trying to find out. We have problems here that no other people our age have ever had. And just as you think you solved them, something comes along and bang! You have to start all over again.
At least you've got someone you can talk to.
Not really. Mother, I never discuss anything serious with her. She doesn't understand. Father's all right. We can talk about everything but one thing.
Mother.
He simply won't talk about her. I don't think you can be really intimate with anyone if he holds something back. Do you?
I think your father's fine.
Oh, he is, Peter. He is he's the only one who's ever given me the feeling that I have any sense. But anyway, nothing can take that place of school and play and friends your own age. Or near your age, can it?
I suppose you miss your friends and all.
It isn't just...
She breaks off, staring up at him for a second.
Isn't it funny, you and I? Here we've been seeing each other every minute for almost a year and a half, and this is the first time we've ever really talked. It helps a lot to have someone to talk to, don't you think? It helps you to let off steam.
Peter going to the door.
Well, anytime you want to let off steam, you can come into my room.
Anne following him.
I can get up an awful lot of steam. You have to be careful how you say that.
It's all right with me.
Do you mean it?
I said it, didn't I? He goes out. Anne stands in her doorway looking after him as Peter gets to his door. He stands for a minute looking back at her. Then he goes into his room. Dussel rises as he comes in and quickly passes him going out. He starts across for his room. Anne sees him coming and pulls her door shut. Dussel turns back towards Peter's room. Peter pulls his door shut. Dussel stands there, bewildered, forlorn. The scene slowly dims out. The curtain falls on the scene. Anne's voice comes over the darkness, faintly at first, and then growing with strength. Anne's voice.
We've had bad news. The people for whom Miep got our ration books have been arrested. So we have had to cut down on our food. Our stomachs are so empty that they rumble and make strange noises in all different keys. Mr. Van Dan's is deep and low, like a bass fiddle. Mine is high, whistling like a flute. As we all sit around waiting for supper, it's like our orchestra tuning up. It only needs Toscanini to raise his baton and we'd be off like the Ride of the Valkyries. Monday the 6th of March, 1944. Mr. Crowler is in the hospital. It seems he has ulcers. Pym says we are his ulcers. Miep has to run the business and us too. The Americans have landed on the southern tip of Italy. Father looks for a quick finish to the war. Mr. Dussel is waiting every day for the warehouse man to demand more money. Have I been skipping too much from one subject to another? I can't help it. I feel that spring is coming. I feel it in my whole body and soul. I feel utterly confused. I'm longing, so longing for everything. For friends, for someone to talk to, someone who understands, someone young who feels as I do.
As these last lines are being said, the curtain rises on the scene. Lights dim on Anne. Her voice fades out. Act 2, Scene 2. It is evening, after supper. From outside, we hear the sound of children playing. With the exception of Mr. Van Dan, all of the grown-ups are in the main room. Mrs. Frank is doing some mending. Mrs. Van Dan is reading a fashion magazine. Mr. Frank is going over business accounts. Mr. Dussel, in his dentist jacket, is pacing up and down, impatient to get into his bedroom. Mr. Van Dan is still upstairs working on a piece of embroidery for an embroidery frame of some sort. In his room, Peter is sitting before the mirror, smoothing his hair. As the scene goes on, he puts on his tie, he brushes his coat, and he puts it on, preparing himself meticulously for a visit from Anne. On his walls are now hung some of Anne's motion picture stars, the Hollywood stars, just gazing at her. In her room, Anne is also getting dressed. She stands before the mirror in her slip, trying various ways of dressing her hair. Margot is seated on the sofa, hemming a skirt for Anne to wear. In the main room, Dussel can stand it no longer. He comes over, rapping sharply on the door of his and Anne's bedroom. Anne calling to him,
No, Mr. Dussel, I'm not dressed yet.
Dussel walks away, furious, sitting down and burying his head in his hands. Anne turns to Margot, inside of the room, and she speaks.
How is that? How does that look?
Margot glancing at her briefly.
Fine.
Anne says,
You didn't even look. Of course I did. It's fine. Margot, tell me. Oh, am I terribly ugly?
Oh, stop fishing.
No, tell me.
Of course you're not.
You've got nice eyes, and A lot of animation and a little vague, aren't you?
Anne says. She reaches over and takes a brassiere out of Margot's sewing basket. She holds it up to herself, studying the effect in the mirror. Outside, Mrs. Frank, feeling sorry for Dussel, comes over, knocking at the girl's door. Mrs. Frank, outside, speaks.
May I come in?
Margot says,
Come in, Mother.
Mrs. Frank, shutting the door behind her, speaks.
Mr. Dussel's impatient to get in here.
Anne, still with the brassiere in her hand, screams.
Heavens, he takes the room for himself the entire day.
Mrs. Frank gently speaks.
Anne, dear, you're not going in again tonight to see Peter, are you?
Anne, dignified, says.
That is my intention.
Mrs. Frank says.
But you've already spent a great deal of time in there today. I was in there exactly twice, once to get the dictionary, and then 3/4 of an hour before supper. Aren't you afraid you're disturbing him?
Anne responds.
Mother, I have some intuition. Then may I ask you this much, Anne? Please don't shut the door when you go in. You sound just like Miss Van Dan.
She throws the brassiere back at Margot's sewing basket and picks up her blouse, putting it on. Mrs. Frank says,
No, I don't mean to suggest anything wrong. I only wish that you wouldn't expose yourself to criticism, that you wouldn't give Mrs. Van Dan the opportunity to be unpleasant. Mrs. Van Dan doesn't need an opportunity to be unpleasant. Everyone's on edge, Anne, worried about Mr. Crowler. This is one more thing. Oh, I'm sorry, Mother. Look, I'm going to Peter's room. I'm not going to let Petronella Van Dan spoil our friendship.
Mrs. Frank hesitates for a second, then goes out, closing the door after her. She gets a pack of playing cards and sits at the center table, playing solitaire. In Anne's room, Margot hands the little finished skirt to Anne. As Anne is putting it on, Margot takes off her high-heeled shoes and stuffs paper in the toes so that Anne can wear them. Margot, speaking to Anne, says, Why don't you two walk in the main room? It'd save a lot of trouble. It's hard on Mother having to listen to those remarks from Mrs. Van Dan and not say a word. Anne speaks. Why doesn't she say a word? I think it's ridiculous to take it and take it. You don't understand Mother at all, do you? She can't talk back. She's not like you. It's just not in her nature to fight back, Anne. Anyway, the only one I worry about is you. I feel awfully guilty about you. She sits on the stool near Margot, putting on Margot's high-heeled shoes.
What about?
Margot says.
I mean, every time I go to Peter's room, I have a feeling I may be hurting you.
Margot shakes her head from side to side, indicating no.
I mean, I don't know if it were me. I mean, I'd be wild. I'd be desperately jealous. I mean, if it were me.
Margot speaks. Well, I'm not.
You don't feel badly, really? Truly? You're not jealous? Of course I'm jealous. I'm jealous that you've got something to get up in the morning for, but jealous of you and Peter? No.
Anne goes back to the mirror. Anne speaks.
Maybe there's nothing to be jealous of. I mean, maybe he doesn't really even like me. Maybe I'm just taking the place of his cat.
She picks up a pair of short white gloves, putting them on.
Wouldn't you like to come in with us?
Margot speaks. I have a book. The sound of children playing outside fades out. In the main room, Dussel can stand it no longer. He jumps up to the bedroom door, knocking at it sharply.
Will you please let me in my room?
Anne just speaks.
Just a minute, dear Mr. Dussel.
She picks up her mother's pink stole and adjusts it elegantly over her shoulders, then gives a last look in the mirror.
Well, here I go. To run the gauntlet.
She stares out, followed by Margot. Dussel, as she appears, comes in the room sarcastically.
Oh, thank you. I can get some sleep.
Dussel goes into his room. Anne goes towards Peter's room, passing Mrs. Van Daan and her parents at the center table. Mrs. Van Daan speaks.
Oh my God, look at her! Oh.
Anne pays no attention. She knocks at Peter's door.
I don't know what good it is to have a son. I never see him. He wouldn't care if I killed myself.
Peter opens the door and stands aside for Anne to come in.
Just a minute, Anne.
She goes to them at the door.
I'd like to say a few words with my son. Do you mind?
Peter and Anne stand waiting.
Peter, I don't want you staying up until all hours of tonight, okay? You've got to have your sleep. You're a growing boy now, you hear?
Mrs. Frank says,
Anne won't be staying late. She's going to bed promptly at 9.
Aren't you, Anne?
Yes, Mother.
To Mrs. Van Daan.
May we go now?
Oh, are you asking me? I didn't know I had anything to say about it.
Mrs. Frank speaks. Listen for the chimes, Anne dear. The two young people go off into Peter's room, shutting the door after them. Mrs. Van Daan speaks to Mrs. Frank.
In my day, it was the boys who called upon the girls, not the girls who called upon the boys.
Mrs. Frank replies.
You know how young people like to feel that they have secrets. Peter's room is the only place where they can talk.
Talk? That's not what they called talk when I was young.
Mrs. Van Daan goes off into the bathroom. Margot settles down to read her book. Mr. Frank puts his papers away and begins a chess game at the center table. He and Mrs. Frank start to play. In Peter's room, Anne speaks to Peter. Indignant, humiliated. Anne speaks.
Aren't they awful? Aren't they impossible? Treating us as if we're still in the nursery.
She sits on the cot. Peter gets a bottle of pop and 2 glasses.
Don't let it bother you. It doesn't bother me. I suppose you can't really blame them. They think back to what they were like at our age. They don't realize how much more advanced we are. When you think what wonderful discussions we've had, I forget. I was going to bring you some more pictures.
Oh, yeah. These are fine. Thanks.
You don't want some more? Miep brought me some new ones.
Peter responds.
Maybe later.
He gives her a glass of pop and some for himself. He sits down, facing her. Anne looking up at one of the photographs.
Oh, I remember when I got that. Oh, I won it. I bet Jopie that I could eat 5 ice cream cones, that we'd all be playing ping pong. We used to have heavenly times. We'd finish up with ice cream at Delphi or the Oasis, where the Jews were allowed. There'd always be a lot of boys. We'd laugh and joke. I'd like to go back to it for a few days, or a week. But after that, I knew I'd be bored to death. I think more seriously about life now. I want to be a journalist or something. I mean, I love to write. What do you want to do?
Peter responds.
I thought I might go off to someplace and work on a farm or something. Some job that doesn't take much brains.
Anne replies.
You shouldn't talk that way. You've got the most awful inferiority complex. I know. I'm not smart. That isn't true. You're much better than I am at dozens of things. Arithmetic and algebra and well, you're a million times better than I am at algebra.
With sudden directness, she says.
You like Margot, don't you? Right from the start, you liked her. Liked her much better than me.
Peter responds uncomfortably.
Oh, I don't know.
In the main room, Mrs. Van Den comes in from the bathroom and goes over to the sink, polishing a coffee pot. Anne whispers and speaks.
It's all right. Everyone feels that way. Margot's so good. She's sweet and bright and beautiful, and I'm not.
Peter says.
I wouldn't say that. Oh, no, I'm not. I know that. Well, I know quite well that I'm not a beauty. I never have been and never shall be.
Peter responds.
I don't agree at all. I think you're pretty. That's not true,
Anne says.
And another thing, you changed at first. I mean, I have?
Well, you used to think that you were awful noisy.
And what do you think now, Peter? How have I changed?
You're quieter?
In his room, Dussel takes his pajamas and toilet articles and goes to the bathroom to change. Anne speaks to Peter face to face.
I'm glad you don't just hate me.
I never said that.
I bet when you get out of here, you'll never think of me again.
Peter speaks.
That's crazy.
Well, when you get back with all of your friends, you're going to say, now what did I ever see in that Mrs. Quack Quack?
Peter replies, I haven't got any friends.
Oh, Peter, of course you have. Everyone has friends.
Not me. I don't want any.
I get along right without them. Does that mean you can get along without me? I think of myself as your friend.
No. If they were all like you,
It'd be different.
He takes the glasses and the bottle and puts them away. There is a second silence, and then Anne speaks, hesitantly, shyly.
Peter, did you ever kiss a girl?
Yes. Once.
Anne to cover her feelings.
That picture's crooked.
Peter goes over, straightening them the photograph.
Was she pretty?
Huh?
The girl that you kissed.
I don't know. I was blindfolded.
He comes back and sits down again.
I was at a party, one of those kissing games.
Anne relieved.
Oh, I don't suppose that really counts, does it?
It did with me.
I've been kissed twice. Once a man I'd never seen before kissed me on the cheek when he picked me up off the ice and I was crying. And the other was Mr. Kufius, a friend of Father's, who kissed my hand. You wouldn't say that those counted, would you?
I wouldn't say so,
says Peter.
I almost for certain that Margot would never kiss anyone unless she was engaged to them. And I'm sure, too, that Mother never touched a man before Pim. But I don't know. Things are just different now. What do you think? Do you think a girl shouldn't kiss anyone except if she's engaged or something? It's so hard to try to think what to do when here we are with the whole world falling around our ears and you think, well, you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow and what do you think?
Peter says.
I suppose it depends on the girl. Some girls, anything they do is wrong, but others, well, it wouldn't necessarily be wrong with them.
The carillon starts to strike 9 o'clock.
I've always thought that when two people... It's 9 o'clock. I have to go.
That's right.
Without moving, Anne says.
Good night.
There's a second pause. Then Peter gets up, looks at Anne in the eyes,
and moves towards the door.
You won't let them stop you coming?
Peter said.
No.
She rises and starts for the door.
Sometime I might bring my diary. There's so many things in that I want to talk over with you. There's a lot to talk about.
What kind of thing?
I would want you to see some of it. I thought you were nothing, just the way you thought about me.
Did you change your mind the way I changed my mind about you? Peter asks.
Well, you'll see.
For a second, Anne stands looking up at Peter, longing for him to kiss her. As he makes no move, she turns away. Then suddenly Peter grabs her awkwardly in his arms, kissing her on the cheek. Anne walks out, dazed, out of breath. She stands for a minute, her back to the people in the main room as she regains her poise. She goes to her mother and father and Margot, silently kissing them. They murmur their good nights to her. As she's about to open her bedroom door, she catches sight of Mrs. Van Daan. She quickly goes to her, taking her face in her hands, kissing her, one cheek, and then the other, her first one on the cheek, and then the other again. Then she hurries off into her room. Mrs. Van Daan looks after her and then looks at Peter's room. Her suspicions are confirmed. Mrs. Van Daan knows and speaks. The lights dim out, and the curtain falls on the scene. In the darkness, Anne's voice comes faintly at first, and then with growing strength, she speaks.
By this time, we all know each other well, so that if anyone starts to tell a story, the rest can finish it for him or her by now. We're having to cut down still further on all of our meals. What makes it worse is the rats have been at work again. They've carried off some of our precious food. Even Mr. Dusa wishes now that Mushi was here. Thursday, the 20th of April, 1944. Invasion fever is mounting every day. Miep tells us that people outside talk of nothing else. For myself, life has become much more pleasant. I often go to Peter's room after supper and don't think that I'm in love, because I'm not, but it does make life more bearable to have someone with whom you can exchange views. No more tonight. P.S. I must be honest. I must confess that I actually live for the next morning and the next meeting. Is there anything lovelier than to sit under the skylight and feel the sun on your cheeks and have a darling boy in your arms? I don't know, but I admit now that I'm glad that the Van Daans had a son and not a daughter. I've outgrown another dress. That's the third. I'm having to wear Margot's clothes after all. I'm working hard on my French, and I'm now reading La Belle Nevernay. As she's saying the last lines, the curtain rises on the scene. Lights dim on Anne's voice as it fades out. Act 2, Scene 3. It is night. A few weeks later. Everyone is in bed. There is complete quiet. In the Van Daan's room, a match flares up for a moment, and then is quickly put out. Mr. Van Daan, in his bare feet, dressed in underwear and trousers, is dimly seen coming stealthily down the stairs and into the main room, where Mrs. and Mr. Frank and Margot are sleeping. He goes to the food safe and again lights a match. He cautiously opens the safe, taking out a half loaf of bread. As he closes the safe, it creaks. He stands rigid. Mrs. Frank sits up in bed. She sees him. Mrs. Frank screaming, Otto! Otto! Come! Schnell! The rest of the people wake up, hurriedly getting up. Mr. Frank! Was ist los?
What's this? Pass it! Dussel, followed by Anne, comes from his room. Mrs. Frank, as she rushes over to Mr. Van Daan. Er is still hard das Essen! Dussel grabbing Mr. Van Daan. You! Give me that! Mrs. Van Daan coming down the stairs. Pootie! Pootie, what is it? Dussel, his hand on Mr. Van Daan's neck. You dirty thief! Stealing our food, you dirty good-for-nothing! Mr. Frank screams. Mr. Dussel, for God's sake! Trying to pull his hands from his throat. Peter! Peter, help me! Peter comes over, trying with Mr. Frank to separate the two struggling men. Let him go! Let go! Dussel drops Mr. Van Daan, pushing him away. He shows them the end of the loaf of bread that he has taken from Mr. Van Daan. Margot turns on the lights. Mrs. Van Daan. Pootie! What is it? All of Mrs. Frank's gentleness, her self-control is gone. She is outraged. In a frenzy of indignation, she speaks. The bread! He was stealing the bread! Mr. Dussel says, It was you! And all the time we thought it was the rats. Mr. Van Daan, how could you? Mr. Van Daan speaks under his breath. I'm hungry. Mrs. Frank, we are hungry, all of us. I see the children getting thinner and thinner. Your own son, Peter, I've heard him moan in his sleep. He's so hungry. And you come in the night and steal food that should go to them, to the children. Mrs. Van Daan going to Mr. Van Daan protectively. He needs more food than the rest of us. He's used to more. He's a big man. Mrs. Van Daan breaks away, going over and sitting on the couch. Mrs. Frank turning on Mrs. Van Daan. And you, Mrs. Van Daan, you're worse than he is. You're a mother, and you sacrifice your child to this man? This. Mr. Frank says, Edith. Edith! Margot picks up the pink woolen stole, putting it over her mother's shoulders. Mrs. Frank, paying no attention, going on to Mrs. Van Daan. Don't think I haven't seen you, always saving those choicest bits for him. I've watched you day after day, and I've held my tongue, but not any longer. Not after this. I want him to go. I want him to get out of here. Edith. Get out of here? What do you mean? Just that. Take your things and get out. Mr. Frank to Mrs. Frank. You're speaking in anger. You cannot mean what you're saying. I mean exactly that. Mrs. Van Daan takes a cover from Frank's bed, pulling it about her. For 2 long years we have lived here side by side. We have respected each other's rights. We have managed to live in peace. Are we now going to throw all of that away? I know this will never happen again, will it, Mr. Van Daan? No. He steals once, he'll steal again, said Mrs. Frank. Mr. Van Daan, holding his stomach, starts for the bathroom. Anne puts her arms around him, helping him up the step. Edith, please, let us be calm. We'll all go to our rooms, and afterwards we'll sit down quietly and talk this out. We'll find some way. Mrs. Frank. No! No more talk. I want them to leave. Mrs. Van Daan responds. You put us out on the streets? There are other hiding places. A cellar, maybe, perhaps a closet. I know, and we have no money left even to pay for that. I will give you money, says Mrs. Frank. Out of my own pocket. I'll give it gladly.
She gets her purse from a shelf and comes back with it.
Mr. Frankie, you told Pooty you'd never forget what he'd done for you when you came to Amsterdam. You said you'd never repay him. That you...
Mrs. Frank counting out the money.
If my husband had any obligation to you, he's paid it over and over.
Edith, I never seen you like this before. I don't know you.
I should have spoken out long ago.
You can't be nice to some people,
says Dussel.
There would have been pity for all of us if you hadn't come in here, Mr. Dussel.
Mr. Frank.
We don't need the Nazis to destroy us. We're destroying ourselves.
He sits down with his head in his hands. Mrs. Frank goes to Mrs. Van Daan. Mrs. Frank giving Miss Van Daan some money. Give this to Miep. She'll find you a place. Anne comes out.
Mother, you're not putting Peter out. Peter hasn't done anything.
Miss Frank says, he'll stay, of course. When I say I must protect the children, I mean Peter, too. Peter rises from the steps where he has been sitting.
I have to go if Father goes.
Mr. Van Daan comes from the bathroom. Mrs. Van Daan hurries to him and takes him to the couch. Then she gets water from the sink to bathe his face. Mrs. Frank, while this is going on. He's no father to you. That man. He doesn't know what it is to be a father. Peter starting for his room.
I wouldn't feel right. I couldn't stay.
Mrs. Frank says, very well then. I'm sorry, Peter. Anne rushing over to Peter.
No! Peter, no!
Peter goes into his room, closing the door after him. Anne turns back to her mother, crying.
I don't care about the food. They can have mine. I don't want it. Only don't send them away. It'd be daylight soon. And they'd be caught.
Margot putting on her arms, comforting around Anne. Please, Mother. Mrs. Frank. They're not going now. They'll stay here until Miep finds them a place. But one thing I insist on. He must never come down here again. He must never come to this room where the food is stored. We'll divide what we have, an equal share for each. Dussel hurries over to get a sack of potatoes from the food safe. Mrs. Frank goes on to Mrs. Van Daan. You can cook it here and take it up to him. Dussel brings the sack of potatoes back to the center table. Oh, no, says Margot. We'd have sunk so far that we're going to fight over a handful of rotten potatoes. Dussel dividing the potatoes into piles.
Mrs. Frank, Mr. Frank, Margot, Anne, Peter, Mrs. Frank, Mr. Van Daan, Mr. Van Daan, myself, Mrs. Frank, Mr. Van Daan, Frank, Anne, Peter, did I give you? Oh, yeah, yes, Peter, Mrs. Van Daan, Mr. Van Daan, myself, Mrs. Frank, Mrs. Frank, Mr. Frank.
The buzzer sounds.
Margot, Peter, Mr. Van Daan, myself, Mr. Frank, Mrs.
It's
Frank,
Miep's
Mr.
signal.
Frank, Margot, and Peter. Oh, it's Miep.
It is Miep. He hurries over to get his overcoat and puts it on. At this hour, Mrs. Frank says, it is trouble. Mr. Franks, as he starts down to unbolt the door, he turns back to Mrs. Frank and says,
I beg you, don't let her see a thing like this.
Dussel counting without stopping again.
And Peter, Mr. Van Daan, Mr. Van Daan, myself. And Peter, Mr. Van Daan, Miss Van Daan, myself.
Margot screams.
Stop it, Mr. Dussel.
Dussel continues.
Mr. Frank, Margot, and Peter, Mrs. Van Daan, Mr. Van Daan, myself, Mrs. Frank.
Mrs. Van Daan screams.
You're keeping the big ones for yourself. All the big ones. Look at the size of that potato. And that potato.
Miep comes in and speaks.
Mr. Frank, the most wonderful news. The invasion, it has begun.
Mr. Frank says,
Go on, tell them! Yes, go upstairs, hurry, quick, tell them!
Miep comes running up the stairs ahead of Mr. Frank. She has the man's raincoat over her nightclothes and a bunch of orange-colored flowers in her hand. Miep kicks in the door and says,
Did you hear that, everybody? Did you hear what I said? The invasion has begun! The invasion!
They all start to stare at Miep, unable to grasp what she is telling. Peter is the first to recover his wits. Peter says,
Where?
Mrs. Van Daan says, when? When, Miep? Miep speaks.
It began early this morning.
As she talks on, the realization of what she has said begins to dawn on them. Everyone goes crazy. A wild demonstration takes place. Mrs. Frank hugs Mr. Van Daan. Mrs. Frank.
Oh, Mr. Van Daan, did you hear that?
Dussel embraces Mrs. Van Daan. We gotta do it. Peter grabs a frying pan and parades around the kitchen, beating on it, singing in the Dutch national anthem. Anne and Margot follow him, singing, weaving in and out among the excited grown-ups. Margot breaks away to take the flowers from Miep and distribute them to everyone. While this pandemonium is going on, Mrs. Frank tries to make herself heard above the excitement.
How do you know, Miep?
Miep says,
The radio, the BBC, they said they landed on the coast of Normandy.
Peter speaks.
The British? Yes, British, Americans, French, Dutch, Poles, Norwegians, all of them. More than 4,000 ships. Churchill spoke, and General Eisenhower. D-Day, they call it.
Mr. Frank, thank God it's come.
At last!
Miep starting out.
I'm going to tell Mr. Crowler. This is going to be better than any blood transfusion.
Mr. Frank stopping her.
What part of Normandy did they land on? Did they say, Miep?
Normandy, that's all I know. Now, I'll be up the minute I hear some more.
She goes hurriedly out. Mr. Frank to Mrs. Frank.
What did I tell you? What did I tell you?
Mrs. Frank indicates that he has forgotten to bolt the door after Miep. He hurries down the steps. Mr. Van Daan, sitting on the couch, suddenly breaks into a convulsive sob. Everybody looks at him, bewildered. Mrs. Van Daan hurrying to him. Pootie, what is it? What happened? Mr. Van Daan speaks.
Please. I'm so ashamed.
Mrs. Frank comes back up the stairs. Dussel says,
Oh, for God's sake! Don't, Pootie! Don't cry!
Margot says,
It doesn't matter now.
Mr. Frank, going over to Mr. Van Daan.
Didn't you hear what Miep said? The invasion has come. We're going to be liberated. This is a time to celebrate.
He embraces Mrs. Frank and then hurries to the cupboard and grabs the cognac and a glass. Mr. Van Daan says,
To steal the bread from children.
Mrs. Frank says,
We've all done things that we're ashamed of.
Anne speaks.
Look at me. The way I've treated Mother. So mean. And so horrid to her.
Mrs. Frank says,
No, Anarchy, no.
Anne runs to her mother, putting her arms around her.
Oh, Mother, was I awful?
Not like me,
says Mr. Van Daan.
No one is as bad as me.
Dussel says to Mr. Van Daan.
Oh, stop it now. Let's be happy.
Mr. Frank, giving Mr. Van Daan a glass of cognac.
Here, schnapps. L'chaim!
Mr. Van Daan takes the cognac, and he drinks as they all watch him. He gives them a feeble smile and puts up her fingers in a V for victory sign. As Mr. Van Daan gives an answering V sign, they are startled to hear a loud sob from behind them. It's Mrs. Frank, stricken with remorse. She is sitting on the other side of the room. Mrs. Frank, through her sobs,
When I think of the terrible things I said.
Mrs. Frank, Anne, and Margot hurry to her, trying to comfort her. Mr. Van Daan brings her his glass of cognac.
No. No. You were right.
That I should speak that way to you, our friends, our guests.
She starts to cry again. Dussel chimes in.
Oh, stop it. You're spoiling the whole invasion.
As they are comforting her, the lights dim out. The curtain falls. Anne's voice faintly at first, and then with growing strength.
We're all in much better spirits these days. There's still excellent news of the invasion. The best part about it is that I have a feeling that friends are coming. Who knows? Maybe I'll be back in school by fall. The joke is on us. The warehouse man doesn't know a thing, and we aren't paying him all that money. Wednesday, the 2nd of July, 1944. The invasion seems temporarily to be bogged down. Mr. Crowler has to have an operation when it looks bad. The Gestapo have found the radio that was stolen. Mr. Dussel says that they'll trace it back to the thief, and then it's just a matter of time that they'll get to us. Everyone is low. Even poor Pym can't raise their spirits. I've often been downcast myself, but never in despair. I can't shake off everything if I write. And that is the great question. Will I ever be able to write well? I want to do so much, and I want to go on living even after my death. Another birthday has gone by, so now I am 15. I already know what I want. I have a goal, an option.
As this is being said, the curtains rise on the scene. The lights dim on, in Anne's voice. Act 2, Scene 4. It is an afternoon a few weeks later. Everyone but Margot is in the main room. There's a sense of great tension. Both Mrs. Frank and Mr. Van Daan are nervously pacing back and forth. Dussel is standing at the window, looking down fixedly at the street below. Peter's at the center table trying to do his lessons. Anne sits opposite him, writing in her diary. Mrs. Van Daan is seated on the couch, her eyes on Mr. Frank as he sits reading. The sound of a telephone ringing comes from the office below. They are all rigid, listening tensely. Dussel rushes down to Mr. Frank.
There it goes again. Telephone. Mr. Frank, do you hear?
Mr. Frank quietly says, "Yes, I hear."
This is the third time, Mr. Frank. The third time. In quick succession. It's a signal. I tell you, it's Miep trying to get to us. For some reason, she can't come to us, and she's trying to warn us of something.
Mr. Frank says, "Please, please." Mr. Van Daan to Dussel.
You're wasting your breath.
Look, something has happened. Mr. Frank, for 3 days now, Miep hasn't come to see us. Today, not a man has come to work. There hasn't been a sound in the building.
Mrs. Frank says,
Perhaps it's Sunday. We may have lost track of the days.
Mr. Van Daan then speaks to Anne.
You with the diary there. What day is it?
Mr. Dussel going to Mrs. Frank.
I don't lose track of the days. I know exactly what day it is. It's Friday, the 4th of August. Friday, and not a man at work.
He rushes back to Mr. Frank, pleading with him, almost in tears.
I tell you, Mr. Crowler's dead. It's the only explanation. He's dead, and they've closed down the building, and Miep's trying to tell us.
Mr. Frank says,
She'd never telephone us.
Dussel frantic.
Mr. Frank, answer that. I beg you, answer it.
No. Just pick it up and listen. You don't have to speak. Just listen and see if it's Miep.
Mr. Dussel speaking at the same time.
For God's sake, I ask you.
No. Mr. Frank says, I've told you no. I'll do nothing that might let anyone know that we're in the building.
Peter says,
Mr. Frank's right.
Mr. Van Daan.
There's no need to tell us what side you're on.
Mr. Frank says,
If we wait patiently, Quietly, I believe help will come.
There's a silence for a minute as they all listen to the telephone ringing. I'm going down, Mr. Dussel says. He rushes down the steps. Mr. Frank tries to unaffectionately to hold him. Dussel runs to the lower door, unbolting it. The door opens to the annex below, and the telephone ringing stops. Dussel bolts the door back and comes back up slowly up the steps. Oh, too late. Mr. Frank goes to Margot in Anne's bedroom. Mr. Van Daan speaks.
Zoe, just wait here until we all die.
Miss Van Daan says hysterically,
I can't stand it. I'll kill myself. Pooty, I'll kill myself.
Mr. Van Daan says,
For God's sake, stop it.
In the distance, a German military band is heard playing a Viennese waltz. Mrs. Van Daan speaks.
I think you'd be glad if I did die, Pooty. I think you want me to die.
Whose fault is it we're in here?
Miss Van Daan starts for her room. He follows, talking to her.
We could have been safe somewhere in America or Switzerland, but no. You wouldn't leave when I wanted to. You couldn't leave your things. You couldn't leave your precious furniture.
Don't touch me!
She hurries up the stairs, followed by Mr. Van Daan. Peter, unable to bear it, goes to his room. Anne looks after him, deeply concerned. Dussel returns to his post at the window. Mr. Frank comes back into the main room and takes a book, trying to read. Mrs. Frank sits near the sink, starting to peel some potatoes. Anne quietly goes to Peter's room, closing the door after her. Peter's lying face down on the cot. Anne leans over him, holding him in her arms, trying to bring him out of his despair. Anne says,
Look, Peter. The sky.
She looks up to the skylight.
What a lovely, lovely day. Aren't the clouds beautiful? You know what I do when it seems as if I couldn't stand being cooped up for one more day? I think myself out. I think myself on a walk in the park where I used to go with Pim, where the jonquils and the crocuses and the violets grow down the slopes. You know the most wonderful part about thinking yourself out? You can have it any way you like. You can have roses and violets and chrysanthemums all blooming at the same time. It's funny. I used to take it all for granted. And now I've gone crazy about everything to do with nature. Haven't you?
Peter speaks.
I've just gone crazy. I think if something doesn't happen soon, if we don't get out of here, I can't stand much more of it.
Anne softly says,
I wish you had a religion, Peter.
No thanks. Not me.
Oh, I don't mean you have to be orthodox or believe in heaven and hell and purgatory and things. I just mean some religion. It doesn't matter what, just to believe in something. When I think of all that's out there, the trees and flowers and seagulls, when I think of the dearness of you, Peter, and the goodness of the people I know, Mr. Crowler, Miep, Dirk, the vegetable man, all risking their lives for us every day. When I think of these good things, I'm not afraid anymore. I find myself and God. And
Peter interrupts, getting up and walking away.
That's fine. But when I begin to think, I get mad. Look at us hiding out for 2 years, not able to move. Caught here like waiting for them to come and get us. And all for what? We're not the only people that have had to suffer. There have always been people that have had to. Sometimes one race. Sometimes another. And yet, that doesn't make me feel any better.
Anne going to him. I know it's terrible, trying to have any faith when people are doing such horrible, but you know what I sometimes think? I think that the world may be going through a phase the way I was with Mother. It'll pass, maybe not for hundreds of years, but someday I really believe, in spite of everything, that people are really good at heart. I want to see something now, Peter said. Not 1,000 years from now. He goes over, sitting down on the cot. Anne looks at him, and then she speaks. But Peter, if you'd only look as it as a part of the great pattern, that we're just a little minute in the life. She breaks off. Listen to us going at each other like a bunch of stupid grown-ups. Look at the sky now. Isn't it lovely? She holds out her hand to him. Peter takes it and rises, standing with her at the window, looking out, his arms around her. Someday when we're outside again, I'm going to... She breaks off as she hears the sound of a car. Breaking and squealing as it comes to a sudden stop. The people in the other room also become aware of the sound. They listen tensely. Another car roars up, screeching, stop. Anne and Peter come from Peter's room. Mr. and Mrs. Van Daan creep down the stairs. Dussel comes out from his room. Everyone is listening, hardly breathing. A doorbell clangs again and again in the building. Mrs. Frank starts quietly down the steps to the door. Mr. Dussel and Peter follow him. Others stand rigid, waiting, terrified. In a few seconds, Dussel comes stumbling back up the stairs. He shakes off Peter's help and goes to his room. Mr. Frank bolts the door below and comes slowly back up the steps. Their eyes are on him as he stands there for a minute, listening to the doorbell. They realize what they feared has happened. Mrs. Van Daan starts to whimper. Mr. Van Daan puts her gently in a chair and hurries off up the stairs to the room to collect their things. Peter goes to comfort his mother. There's a sound of violent pounding on the door below. Mr. Frank quietly. For the past 2 years, we have lived in fear. Now we can live in hope. The pounding below becomes more insistent. There are muffled sounds of voices shouting.
Brechen! Ja! Aufmachen! Da drinnen! Aufmachen! Schnell! Open up!
The street door below is forced open. We hear a heavy trot of footsteps coming up. Mr. Frank gets 2 school bags from the shelves and gives one to Anne and the others to Margot. He goes to get a bag for Mrs. Frank. The sound of feet coming up grows louder. Peter comes to Anne, kissing her goodbye. And then he goes to his room to collect his things. The buzzer of the door starts to ring. Mr. Frank brings Mrs. Frank a bag. They stand together, waiting. We hear the thud of gun butts on the door. Trying to break it down.
Yes!
Anne stands holding her school satchel,
Yes! Öffnen!
looking over her father and mother with a soft, reassuring smile.
Yes!
She is no longer a child, but a woman with courage to meet whatever lies ahead.
Öffnen! Yes!
Ist geöffnet! Ist geöffnet!
The lights dim out. The curtain falls on the ceiling. We hear a mighty crash. And the door is shattered. After a second, Anne's voice is heard. And so it seems our stay here is over. They're waiting for us now. They've allowed us 5 minutes to get our things.
Beeil dich, lass uns
We
gehen.
can each take a bag and whatever it will hold of clothing.
Eile!
Nothing else.
Eile!
So, dear diary, that means I must leave you behind. Goodbye for a while. P.S. Please, Miep or Mr. Crowler or anyone else, if you should find this diary, will you please keep it safe for me? Because someday I hope.
Jetzt stirbst du.
Her voice stops abruptly. There is silence. After a second, the curtain rises. Act 2, Scene 5. It is again the afternoon in November 1945. The rooms are as we saw them in the first scene. Mr. Crowler has joined Miep and Mr. Frank. There are coffee cups on the table. We see a great change in Mr. Frank. He is calm now. His bitterness is gone. He slowly turns a few pages of the diary. They are blank. Mr. Frank speaks. No more. He closes the diary and puts it down on the couch beside him. Miep is standing there and she says, I'd gone back to the country to find food. When I got back, the block was surrounded by police. Mr. Crowler speaks and says,
We made it our business to learn how they knew. It was the thief. The thief who told them.
Miep goes up to the gas burner, bringing back a pot of coffee. Mr. Frank, after a pause.
It seems strange to say this, that anyone could be happy in a concentration camp.
But Anne was happy in the camp in Holland, where they first took us. After 2 years of being shut up in these rooms, she could be out in the sunshine and the fresh air that she loved. Miep offering coffee to Mr. Frank. A little more? Mr. Frank holding his cup up to her. Mr. Frank holding out his coffee cup to her.
The news of the war was good. The British and Americans were sweeping through France.
We felt sure that they would get to us in time. In September, we were told that we were to be shipped to Poland. The men to one camp, the women to another. I was sent to Auschwitz. They were sent to Belsen. In January, we were freed, the few of us who were left. The war wasn't yet over, so it took us a long time to get home. We would be sent here and there behind the enemy lines so that we would be safe. Each time our train would stop at a siding or a crossing, we'd all get out and go from group to group. Where were you? Were you at Belsen, at Buchwald, at Mauthausen? And we could hear their voice.
Is it possible that you knew my wife?
Did you ever see my husband?
My son!
My daughter. That's how I found out about my wife's death. Of Margot. The Van Dans. Dussel. But Anne, I still hoped. Yesterday I went to Rotterdam. I heard of a woman there. She had been in Belsen with Anne. But I know now. He picks up the diary again and turns the pages back to find a certain passage. As he finds it, we hear Anne's voice. In spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. Mr. Frank slowly closes the diary. She puts me to shame. They are silent. The curtain
losers.